A poor student had a one-night stand with a mafia boss to save his dying mother. What happened next would change both of their lives forever. Chapter 1. The rain fell heavy over Brooklyn that October night, turning the streets into rivers of reflected neon and broken dreams. Emily Carter stood outside Mercy General Hospital, her thin jacket soaked through, her hands trembling as she stared at the crumpled papers in her grip. $300,000. That was the price of her mother's life. $300,000 for the heart surgery that Medicare would not cover, that no insurance would touch, that no loan officer would approve for a 22-year-old nursing student with nothing but debt to her name. She had tried everything, every charity, every foundation, every crowdfunding platform that promised miracles but delivered only silence. Her mother, Sarah Carter, had been a school teacher for 30 years before her heart began to fail. She had given everything to her students, to her community, to her only daughter. And now at 53, she lay in a hospital bed with tubes in her arms and a clock ticking down the days she had left. Emily wiped the rain from her face, though she could not tell anymore which drops were water and which were tears. She had $17 in her checking account. She had already sold her car, her laptop, her grandmother's wedding ring. She had taken double shifts at the diner until her feet bled and her eyes could barely stay open during her nursing clinicals. None of it was enough. None of it would ever be enough. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out with shaking fingers and saw the message from her roommate, Jade. There was a number, a contact. Someone who could help, Jade said. Someone who paid well for companionship at exclusive events. No questions asked, no strings attached. One night, and Emily could have enough to start. One night, and maybe she could find a way. Emily stared at the number until the rain blurred the screen. She thought of her mother's smile, the way she still hummed old songs even when the pain was unbearable, the way she had worked 3 jobs to put Emily through her first 2 years of college before the diagnosis came. She thought of the doctors' faces, the sympathetic tilts of their heads, the gentle suggestions that she should start preparing for the worst. She pressed the number before she could change her mind. The voice on the other end was female, professional, cold. There was an event tonight, the woman explained. A private gathering at a penthouse in Manhattan. The client was particular, but generous. If Emily could be ready in 2 hours, a car would pick her up. The payment would be $50,000, transferred immediately upon arrival. All she had to do was be pleasant company for the evening. That was all. Emily knew it was more than that. She was not naive. She had grown up in a neighborhood where girls disappeared into that world and never came back the same. But her mother's face floated in her mind, pale against the hospital pillow, and she heard herself saying yes. She heard herself giving her address. She heard the line go dead. And then there was only the rain. The car arrived at exactly 9 o'clock. It was black, sleek, expensive in a way that made Emily feel like she was entering another dimension. The driver did not speak. He simply opened the door and waited while she climbed inside, her borrowed dress clinging to her skin, her heart pounding so loud she was certain he could hear it. Manhattan glittered through the tinted windows like a city made of diamonds and danger. Emily watched the streets pass, the restaurants and theaters and crowds of people who had never had to choose between their dignity and their mother's life. She wondered what they would think if they knew. She wondered what she thought of herself. The penthouse was on the 47th floor of a building that had no name on the outside, only an address and a doorman who looked like he could stop a train with his bare hands. Emily was escorted through a marble lobby, into a private elevator, and up into the sky. When the doors opened, she stepped into a world she had only seen in movies. The space was vast and modern, all clean lines and dark wood and windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a view of the entire city spread out below like a constellation. There were people everywhere, men in suits that cost more than her annual tuition, women dripping in jewels, servers gliding between them with champagne and whispered secrets. Music played softly from invisible speakers, something classical and melancholic that matched the strange tension in the air. Emily felt immediately out of place. Her dress was borrowed from Jade, a simple black thing that had seemed elegant in her cramped apartment, but now felt cheap and obvious. Her heels were scuffed. Her hair was still damp at the ends from the rain. She wanted to turn around, to flee back into the elevator and forget this entire night. But then a hand touched her elbow, and a voice spoke close to her ear. Dominic Ferraro was not what she expected. She had imagined someone older, someone cruel, someone whose wealth was written in the hardness of his eyes. But the man who stood before her was perhaps 35, with dark hair swept back from a face that was more striking than handsome, all sharp angles and deep shadows. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and when they met hers, she felt something shift in her chest, like a lock clicking open. He did not smile. He simply looked at her, studied her, as if he could read every desperate thought in her head, every fear and hope and shame. Then he extended his hand and said her name, Emily, like he had known it all along, like he had been waiting for her. The night unfolded in fragments after that. She remembered conversations she did not understand, introductions to people whose names blurred together, the weight of his gaze following her across every room. He stayed close, but never touched her, never made demands, never treated her like the transaction she knew herself to be. He asked her questions instead, real questions about her studies, her mother, her dreams for the future. He listened like her answers mattered. He looked at her like she was more than a price tag. At midnight, the guests began to leave. Emily stood by the window, watching the city lights blur through the glass, feeling the champagne warm in her veins and the exhaustion heavy in her bones. She had expected to feel degraded by now. She had expected to hate herself, to hate him, to count the minutes until she could escape. Instead, she felt strangely calm, strangely seen. Dominic appeared beside her, his reflection ghosting across the glass. He told her she could leave now if she wanted. The money had already been transferred. She had fulfilled her obligation, and his driver would take her anywhere she needed to go. There was no pressure, no expectation. The choice was hers. Emily turned to face him. She saw the lines around his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the careful control with which he held himself. She saw a man who was used to taking whatever he wanted, but who was offering her a door instead. And in that moment, she made a choice that would define everything that came after. She stayed. What happened in the hours that followed was not what she had prepared herself for. There was tenderness where she had expected coldness. There was honesty where she had expected lies. Dominic told her fragments of his own story, the empire he had inherited, the weight of a legacy written in shadows, the loneliness that came with a throne no one else could understand. Emily told him about her mother, about the hospital, about the terror of watching someone you love fade away while the world keeps spinning. They talked until the city outside began to lighten, until exhaustion won and she fell asleep in a bed that was larger than her entire apartment. When she woke, she was alone. The sheets beside her were cold, but there was a note on the pillow, a phone number, a single line written in sharp, elegant script. If you ever need anything, anything at all. Emily folded the note carefully and tucked it into her purse. She found her dress laid out on a chair, cleaned and pressed. She found a car waiting for her downstairs and a driver who took her back to Brooklyn without a single question. She found $50,000 in her account, just as promised. But she also found something else, a feeling she could not name lodged somewhere beneath her ribs like a splinter of glass. The memory of storm-gray eyes and a voice that had asked her about her dreams. The echo of a night that should have been a transaction but had felt, impossibly, like a beginning. She told herself it was over. She told herself she would never see him again, that their worlds were too different, that what had happened was a desperate act born of desperate circumstances. She would use the money for her mother's surgery. She would finish her degree. She would build a life that had nothing to do with penthouse parties and men who commanded empires. But even as she walked into the hospital that morning, even as she held her mother's hand and told her that help was coming, Emily knew she was lying to herself. Something had shifted in the dark hours of that October night, something that could not be undone. And somewhere across the city, in a penthouse overlooking Manhattan, Dominic Ferraro stood at the same window where they had talked, watching the morning light spread across the skyline. He held a photograph in his hand, a background check he had ordered the moment she walked into the room. Emily Carter, 22 years old, nursing student, daughter of a dying woman, a girl who had walked into his world with nothing but courage and desperation, who had looked at him not with the fear he was used to, but with something that resembled understanding. He had let hundreds of people leave that penthouse over the years without a second thought, but he could not stop thinking about her. He could not stop seeing the way she had stood by the window, her reflection fragile against the lights, her voice steady as she talked about losing her mother. He could not stop wondering what it would be like to see her again. Dominic Ferraro was not a man who believed in fate. He had built his empire on calculation, on control, on the ruthless elimination of anything that threatened his power. But standing there in the morning light, he felt something he had not felt in years. curiosity, interest, the dangerous beginning of something more. He tucked the photograph into his desk and made a decision. He would see her again, not because he needed to, not because it served his interests, but because for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wanted to. The story was just beginning. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you are not, you are missing stories that will stay with you for days. Subscribe now and be part of this journey. Chapter 2. 3 weeks passed. Emily watched the numbers on her mother's charts improve day by day, watched the color return to her cheeks, watched the doctors nod with cautious optimism. The surgery had been successful. Sarah Carter was going to live. Every time Emily sat beside her bed and listened to her mother's steady heartbeat on the monitor, she told herself it was worth it. Everything she had done, everything she had become for one night, was worth this moment. But the money was running out. Hospital bills, medications, follow-up appointments, the rent on her apartment that she had already missed twice. $50,000 had seemed like a fortune when it landed in her account, but it was sand slipping through her fingers now, disappearing faster than she could count it. She picked up extra shifts at the diner. She sold her textbooks. She ate ramen for every meal, and still the numbers kept falling. And through it all, she could not stop thinking about him. The note stayed folded in her wallet, next to her library card and her student ID. If you ever need anything. She must have read those words 1,000 times, tracing the sharp slant of his handwriting, remembering the weight of his gaze across that moonlit room. She told herself she would not call. She told herself it was weakness, desperation, the same mistake she had already made once. But the note stayed where it was, and some nights she pulled it out and stared at it until the letters blurred. It was Jade who finally forced the issue. Her roommate came home one evening to find Emily hunched over a pile of bills, tears streaming silently down her face. Jade sat beside her, wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and asked the question Emily had been avoiding. What about the man from that night? Emily shook her head. She could not go back to him. She could not become someone who relied on a stranger's charity, who sold pieces of herself to survive. She had made one desperate choice, and it had saved her mother's life. But that did not mean she could keep making it. Jade was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that changed everything. What if it is not about money? What if he actually cares? Emily laughed, a bitter sound that scraped her throat. Men like Dominic Ferraro did not care about girls like her. They used people. They discarded them. That was how they built their empires. But even as she said the words, she was not sure she believed them. She remembered the way he had listened to her, really listened, like her voice was the only sound in the room. She remembered the way he had given her a choice when he could have simply taken. She remembered the note, those 6 words that suggested something beyond transaction. The phone call came at 2 in the morning. Emily was half asleep when her phone buzzed on the nightstand, displaying a number she did not recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something made her answer, some instinct she could not explain. His voice was the same as she remembered, low and controlled, like a river running over stones. He asked if she was awake. He asked if she was all right. He told her that he had heard about her situation, that he had people who kept him informed about things that interested him, and that she interested him. Emily sat up in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She asked him what he wanted. She braced herself for the answer, for the proposition she was certain was coming. But Dominic surprised her. He said he wanted to offer her a job, a real job, legitimate and legal, nothing like what she might be imagining. His organization ran several businesses on the surface, including a chain of private medical clinics that served high-profile clients. They needed nursing staff. The pay was exceptional. The hours were flexible. She could continue her studies, care for her mother, and build a life that did not require her to choose between her dignity and her survival. Emily was silent for so long that he asked if she was still there. She was there. She was just trying to understand why. Why would a man like him offer her this? What did he gain? What did he expect in return? Dominic's answer was simple. He said that he had met many people in his life, people who wanted his money, his power, his protection. But he had never met anyone who looked at him the way she had that night, not with fear, not with greed, but with something that felt almost like recognition, like she saw something in him that he had forgotten was there. He was not asking for anything in return. He was offering her a chance. If she wanted to take it, his driver would pick her up tomorrow morning. If she did not, he would never contact her again. Emily stared at the ceiling of her cramped bedroom, listening to Jade snore softly in the next room. feeling the weight of the bills still scattered across her desk. She thought about her mother, about the months of recovery still ahead, about the future she had been fighting so hard to build. She said yes. The clinic was not what she expected. It was located in a brownstone building in the Upper East Side, elegant and discreet, with no sign on the door, and a waiting room that looked more like a luxury hotel lobby than a medical facility. The patients who came through were exactly what Dominic had described: politicians, executives, celebrities who needed treatment without cameras, people who paid premium prices for privacy and excellence. Emily's role was straightforward at first. She assisted with routine procedures, took vitals, managed records. Her supervisor was a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Helena Vance, who had worked for Dominic's organization for 15 years, and who made it clear from the beginning that excellence was the only acceptable standard. There were no second chances here, no excuses. If Emily wanted to stay, she would have to prove herself every single day. She threw herself into the work with everything she had. She arrived early and stayed late. She studied medical journals in her spare time, asked questions, volunteered for the difficult cases that other nurses avoided. Within a month, Dr. Vance had stopped watching her with suspicion and started watching her with something that looked almost like respect. But it was not just the clinic that was changing Emily's life. It was him. Dominic appeared at the brownstone once a week, sometimes twice. He came to check on the operations, to meet with doctors, to ensure that everything was running smoothly. But Emily noticed that his visits always seemed to coincide with her shifts. She noticed the way his gaze found her across the waiting room, the way he lingered near her station, the way he asked about her mother's recovery with a genuine interest that seemed impossible for a man of his position. They began to talk. Brief conversations at first, stolen moments between her duties and his meetings. He asked about her classes, her goals, the kind of nurse she wanted to become. She asked about his business, his family, the weight she sometimes saw in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. He answered some questions and deflected others, but he never lied to her. He never pretended to be something he was not. Emily learned that Dominic was 34 years old, the only son of a man who had built an empire in the shadows and left it to him at 22. She learned that his mother had died when he was young, that he had a sister he rarely spoke about, that he had spent his entire adult life carrying a legacy he had never asked for. She learned that he was respected by some and feared by many, but trusted by almost no one. And slowly, impossibly, she began to trust him. It happened in small moments, the way he remembered her coffee order, the way he noticed when she was exhausted and quietly arranged for her schedule to be adjusted, the way he sent flowers to her mother's hospital room without ever mentioning it. These were not the actions of a man who saw her as a transaction. These were the actions of someone who was paying attention, someone who cared. Emily tried to resist. She reminded herself of who he was, what he represented, the darkness that surely lurked beneath the tailored suits and careful words. She reminded herself that she was a nursing student from Brooklyn, that she had no business in his world, that whatever was growing between them could only end in disaster. But her heart did not listen. Her heart saw the way he looked at her and felt something crack open inside her chest. Her heart heard his voice on those late-night phone calls, the conversations that stretched for hours, the confessions that neither of them would have made in daylight. Her heart was falling, and she did not know how to stop it. The turning point came on a night in late November. Emily was closing up the clinic when she heard a commotion at the back entrance. She rushed toward the sound and found Dominic being helped through the door by two of his men, his face pale, his left arm pressed against his side where a dark stain was spreading across his white shirt. She did not think. She simply acted. She cleared a treatment room, gathered supplies, and began to work with hands that were steadier than she would have expected. The wound was not serious, a graze from something she did not ask about, but it needed cleaning and stitching and the kind of careful attention that could not be trusted to just anyone. Dominic watched her as she worked. His breathing was controlled despite the pain, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finally tied off the last stitch and stepped back to examine her work, he reached out and caught her wrist. His grip was gentle, almost questioning. He asked her why she had not called for Dr. Vance, why she had handled it herself, without hesitation, without asking what had happened. Emily looked down at his hand on her wrist, at the contrast of his scarred knuckles against her skin. She told him the truth. She told him that she had not thought about it. She had just seen him hurt, and she had needed to help. It was that simple. It was that complicated. Dominic was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something that changed everything between them. He pulled her closer, slow enough that she could have resisted, and pressed his forehead against hers. He breathed her in like she was oxygen, like she was the only real thing in a world made of shadows. He told her that he was not a good man. He told her that his hands had done things she could not imagine, that his name carried debts she could never understand. He told her that she deserved better, someone clean, someone simple, someone who could give her a life without fear. But he also told her that he could not stay away from her. He had tried. He had spent weeks trying to convince himself that she was just another person passing through his world, that what he felt was curiosity, nothing more. But it was not curiosity. It was something deeper, something that terrified him more than any enemy he had ever faced. Emily listened to his confession, with her heart pounding in her throat. She thought about everything she knew about him, everything she suspected, everything she feared. She thought about her mother, recovering in a hospital bed paid for by his money. She thought about the future she had imagined, safe and ordinary and far away from this. Then she leaned forward and closed the distance between them. Chapter 3. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Emily had ever experienced. She learned to navigate two worlds simultaneously, the bright, sterile corridors of the clinic where she was building a career, and the shadowed depths of Dominic's empire where she was becoming something else entirely. She learned to read the signals his men exchanged, the subtle hierarchies that governed every interaction. She learned which questions she could ask and which doors she should never try to open. But she also learned the man behind the legend. She learned that Dominic rose before dawn every morning to read reports and make calls that spanned 3 continents. She learned that he played classical piano when he could not sleep, filling the penthouse with Chopin and Debussy at 3 in the morning. She learned that he kept a photograph of his mother in his desk drawer, a faded image of a dark-haired woman with eyes like his own, and that he touched it sometimes when he thought no one was watching. She learned that he was capable of extraordinary tenderness and equally extraordinary coldness, and that both came from the same source, a heart that had been broken so many times he had built walls around it high enough to block out the sky. She learned that letting her in was the hardest thing he had done in years. Their relationship existed in the spaces between his responsibilities and her ambitions. Late dinners after her shifts, early mornings before his meetings, phone calls that lasted until one of them fell asleep. He respected her work, never asking her to compromise her studies or abandon her goals. She respected his secrets, never pushing for answers he was not ready to give. But Emily was not naive. She knew that Dominic's world was not one she could enter without consequences. She saw the way his men watched her, the mixture of curiosity and suspicion in their eyes. She heard the whispered conversations that stopped when she walked into a room. She understood that to them she was an unknown variable, a potential weakness in an organization that could not afford weakness. It was Marco who finally confronted her. He was Dominic's second in command, a man built like a wall with eyes that missed nothing. He found her alone in the clinic one evening, finishing up paperwork, and he sat across from her without asking permission. He told her that he had worked for the Ferraro family for 20 years. He had watched Dominic grow from a boy into a man who carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders. He had seen people come and go, women who thought they could change him, enemies who thought they could destroy him. None of them had succeeded. Then he asked her a question that cut straight to the bone. He asked her what she wanted from Dominic, really wanted beneath all the pretty words and tender moments, because if she was here for money, for power, for access to his world, she would find that the price was higher than she could imagine. And if she was here for him, truly here for the man and not the myth, then she needed to understand what that meant. Emily met his gaze without flinching. She told him that she had not asked for any of this. She had walked into a party looking for a way to save her mother's life, and she had found something she never expected. She told him that she loved Dominic, loved him in a way that terrified her, loved him despite everything she knew and everything she suspected. She was not here for his money or his power. She was here because when she was with him, she felt seen for the first time in her life. Marco studied her for a long moment. Then, without another word, he stood up and left. That night, when Emily told Dominic about the conversation, something shifted in his expression. He pulled her close and held her like she might disappear if he let go. He told her that Marco had never spoken to any woman in his life the way he had spoken to her. That simple conversation was more meaningful than she could know. The night deepened around them, and in the quiet of his penthouse, they talked about things they had never discussed before. Dominic told her about the organization he ran, the legitimate businesses that operated in daylight, and the shadow networks that moved beneath them. He told her about the enemies who constantly circled, waiting for weakness. He told her about the price of power, the loneliness that came with a throne, the knowledge that every person in his life wanted something from him, every person except her. He told her that she had given him something he had stopped believing existed. Hope, the hope that maybe somehow he could have something real, something that was not built on fear or obligation, but on choice. She had chosen him, and he was choosing her back. Emily felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she listened. She thought about the girl she had been 3 months ago, standing in the rain outside a hospital, clutching papers that represented her mother's death sentence. She thought about how far she had traveled, not just in miles, but in understanding. She had walked into Dominic's world, looking for salvation, and she had found something far more precious. She had found love. But even as that love grew stronger, so did the shadows gathering around them. It started with small signs, a car that seemed to follow Emily home from the clinic, a sense of being watched when she walked through crowds. Dominic dismissed her concerns at first, assuring her that his security was the best money could buy, that no one would dare touch someone under his protection. But Emily could see the tension building in his shoulders. She could hear the urgency in his late-night calls. Something was wrong. Something was coming. The truth arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, delivered in a manila envelope that appeared on the reception desk of the clinic, with no return address and no explanation. Inside were photographs. Emily walking into Dominic's building. Emily holding his hand as they left a restaurant. Emily, asleep in his bed, captured through a telephoto lens from a building across the street. And beneath the photographs, a single sentence typed on white paper, "She is your weakness now." Dominic's reaction was immediate and terrifying. Within hours, the penthouse was swarming with his men. The security protocols tripled. Emily's entire routine mapped and analyzed for vulnerabilities. He paced like a caged animal, his usual control cracking at the edges. And when Emily tried to touch him, to calm him, he pulled away like her presence caused him physical pain. He told her she had to leave. He told her this was exactly what he had been afraid of, why he had tried to stay away from her, why he had known from the beginning that letting her into his life was a mistake. His enemies would use her against him. They would hurt her to hurt him. The only way to keep her safe was to send her away, far from his world, far from the target on his back. Emily refused. She stood in the middle of his fortress, surrounded by men who could end lives with a single command, and she told him that she was not going anywhere. She had not survived everything she had survived to run away at the first sign of danger. She had not fallen in love with him just to abandon him when he needed her most. She told him that she understood the risks. She understood that his world was violent, that his enemies were real, that there might come a day when love was not enough to protect them. But she also understood something else. She understood that running away would not make her safe. It would just make her alone. And she would rather face whatever was coming by his side than spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been. Dominic stared at her like she was speaking a language he had never heard. Then slowly the tension drained from his shoulders. He crossed the room and took her face in his hands, studying her like he was memorizing every detail. He asked her if she was sure. He asked her if she understood what she was choosing. Emily smiled through her tears. She told him that she had never been more sure of anything in her life. If you are feeling what Emily is feeling right now, if your heart is racing with hers, then leave a comment below. Write the words, "I choose love." Let the world know that some choices are worth every risk. Chapter 4. The enemy had a name, Viktor Kozlov. He was Russian, ruthless, and he had been trying to expand into Dominic's territory for years. The photographs were just the opening move in a chess game that had been building for months, a message designed to shake Dominic's confidence and expose his vulnerabilities. Emily learned all of this in fragments, pieced together from conversations she overheard and explanations Dominic offered in the quiet hours between crisis and calm. Victor was not just a rival. He was a man who had built his empire on brutality, who treated human beings like commodities to be bought and sold. He was everything Dominic had spent his adult life fighting against, and he was coming for everything Dominic loved, including her. The security around Emily intensified until she could barely recognize her own life. There were guards outside her apartment, guards outside the clinic, guards following her car whenever she moved through the city. She ate breakfast with armed men standing just out of sight. She fell asleep to the sound of radio check-ins echoing through the walls. It should have been suffocating. It should have made her feel like a prisoner, but somehow it did not, because through it all Dominic was there. He called her every morning before her shift. He appeared at the clinic every evening to drive her home. He held her at night and whispered plans for a future she was starting to believe was possible. He told her about the legitimate businesses he was expanding, the medical clinics and real estate ventures, and charitable foundations that could eventually replace the shadow networks. He told her about his dream of leaving the empire behind, of building something clean that he could pass on to children who would never have to carry the weight he had carried. He asked her if that was something she wanted too. Emily said yes. She said yes to the future. She said yes to the risk. She said yes to him. But Victor was not interested in their dreams. The attack came on a Tuesday evening. Emily was finishing her shift at the clinic when the power went out. The emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in a dim red glow, and then she heard the screaming from the waiting room. She ran toward the sound and found chaos. Two of the guards who usually stood at the entrance were down. Men in black masks were pushing through the front door, weapons raised, moving with the coordinated efficiency of professionals. Emily did not have time to think. She grabbed the nearest patient, an elderly woman who had come in for a routine checkup, and pulled her toward the back of the building. The emergency exit was 30 feet away, 20 feet, 10. The door burst open just as she reached it, and for a terrifying moment, she was certain it was more attackers. But the face that appeared was Marco's, his expression grim, his hand already reaching for her. She pushed the elderly woman toward him and turned back for the others. There were still people in the waiting room. Staff, patients, people who had come here trusting that they would be safe. Marco grabbed her arm and told her to stop. He told her that the clinic was lost, that the important thing was getting her out. That was what Dominic had ordered. That was what he was going to do. Emily looked back at the chaos behind them, at the figures moving through the smoke, and felt something break inside her. These were innocent people. They had nothing to do with the war between Dominic and Victor. They did not deserve to become casualties, but Marco was already pulling her through the door into the cold night air toward a car that was waiting with its engine running. She caught one last glimpse of the clinic as they drove away, saw the flames beginning to lick at the windows, and then it was gone. The penthouse was a fortress by the time they arrived. Dominic met them at the elevator, his face a mask of controlled fury that Emily had never seen before. He took her in his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe, and she felt his whole body shaking beneath the calm exterior. He asked her if she was hurt. He ran his hands over her arms, her face, her shoulders, checking for damage with the desperate attention of someone who had nearly lost everything. Emily told him she was fine, physically at least, but she could not stop thinking about the people at the clinic, the staff who had become her colleagues, the patients who had trusted her. She asked what had happened to them. Dominic's jaw tightened. He told her that his men were handling it. The people who could be saved were being saved. The others. He did not finish the sentence. Emily pulled back to look at him. She saw the weight settling onto his shoulders, the guilt that was already forming behind his eyes. She knew he was blaming himself. She knew he believed that this was his fault, that his enemies had found a way to hurt him through the people he was supposed to protect. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. She told him that this was not his fault. Victor had made a choice. Victor had crossed a line, and Victor would pay for what he had done. Something shifted in Dominic's expression. The fury was still there, but now it was focused, honed to a razor edge. He told her that she was right. Victor had made his move, and now it was his turn. The war was no longer a theoretical threat. It was here, and Dominic was going to finish it. The next few days were a blur of strategy and preparation. Emily was kept close to the penthouse, surrounded by security, while Dominic marshaled his forces. She watched him transform from the tender man she had come to love into something harder, colder, more dangerous. He gave orders with a voice like ice. He planned operations like a general preparing for battle. He became the Don that the world feared, and she understood finally how he had survived so long in a world that destroyed weaker men. But at night, when they were alone, he was still hers. He held her in the darkness and told her that it would be over soon. He promised her that when the fighting was done, they would have the future they had talked about. The clinic would be rebuilt, the empire would evolve, and they would be together, without shadows, without fear. Emily believed him. She had to believe him, because the alternative was too terrible to consider. The operation was set for Friday night. Dominic's intelligence had located Victor's base of operations, a warehouse complex in the industrial district that served as his headquarters. The plan was surgical, designed to minimize casualties and maximize impact. Dominic would lead the assault personally. He would end this war the only way it could be ended. Emily asked to come with him. She knew it was foolish. She knew she would only be a liability. But she could not stand the thought of waiting in the penthouse, not knowing if he was alive or dead, praying that every passing minute was not his last. Dominic refused. He told her that her safety was the one thing he would not negotiate. If something happened to him, she needed to survive. She needed to take care of her mother, to finish her degree, to build the life she deserved. His death could not also be hers. Emily wanted to argue. She wanted to scream that his life was hers now, that they had crossed a threshold together and there was no going back. But she saw the determination in his eyes, and she knew that fighting would only add to his burden, so she kissed him instead. She kissed him like it might be the last time, like she could pour every feeling she had ever had into that single moment. And when he finally pulled away, she saw tears in his eyes that matched her own. He told her he loved her. He told her that she had changed everything. Then he walked out the door. And she was alone. The hours that followed were the longest of Emily's life. She paced the penthouse, unable to sit still, unable to focus on anything except the ticking of the clock and the silence of her phone. She thought about her mother, recovering in a facility upstate, unaware of the danger her daughter faced. She thought about the future Dominic had promised, the life they were supposed to build together. She prayed. For the first time in years, she actually prayed. The call came at 3 a.m. Marco's voice was exhausted but triumphant. Victor was finished. The operation had succeeded. Dominic was alive. Emily collapsed against the wall, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. She was crying and laughing at the same time, overwhelmed by a relief so intense it felt like drowning in reverse. Marco told her that Dominic was on his way home. He told her that it was over. Emily whispered her thanks into the phone and hung up. Then she sat on the floor of the penthouse and waited for the man she loved to return. Chapter 5. Dominic came home just as dawn was breaking over Manhattan. Emily heard the elevator open and ran toward him, throwing herself into his arms before she could see the extent of his injuries. He caught her, holding her tight despite the wounds she would later tend, and they stood together in the golden light of morning while the city woke up around them. He was hurt, a gash across his forearm that would need stitches, bruises that would take weeks to fade. But he was alive. He was whole. He was hers. Emily led him to the bedroom and began the slow process of cleaning and bandaging his wounds. He sat quietly under her hands, watching her work with an expression she could not read. When she finally finished and looked up to meet his eyes, she saw something there that took her breath away. He told her that he had made a decision. In those hours of fighting, with danger surrounding him and death waiting at every corner, he had realized something. The empire he had inherited, the shadow world that had been his whole life, it was not worth dying for. It was not worth losing her. He was going to step back. Not all at once, not overnight, but over the next few years. He was going to transition the organization toward legitimacy, promote men he trusted to handle the operations that remained, and build a new life, a clean life, a life that had room for the future they had talked about. Emily searched his face for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that he was promising more than he could deliver. She found none, only the quiet certainty of a man who had finally decided what he wanted. She asked him if he was sure. She asked him if he could really walk away from everything he had built, everything he had been. Dominic smiled, the first real smile she had seen in days. He told her that he was not walking away from everything. He was walking toward something. He was walking toward her. The months that followed were a masterclass in transformation. Dominic kept his word, dismantling the shadow networks piece by piece while expanding the legitimate businesses that would replace them. The medical clinics multiplied, opening in underserved neighborhoods across the city. The real estate ventures grew, providing housing and jobs for communities that had been forgotten. The charitable foundation that bore his mother's name became one of the largest in the state. Emily watched it all unfold with a mixture of pride and wonder. She finished her nursing degree at the top of her class. She was offered a position at one of the clinics as a senior nurse, a role that came with responsibilities she had never imagined. She visited her mother every weekend, watching Sarah grow stronger and more joyful as the months passed. And through it all, Dominic was by her side. They moved into a brownstone in Brooklyn, not far from where Emily had grown up. They hosted dinners with friends, took walks in Prospect Park, argued about movies, and made up before bed. They lived a life so ordinary, it sometimes felt like a dream, like any moment she might wake up back in her cramped apartment with nothing but bills and desperation. But it was real. All of it was real. 1 year after the night that changed everything, Dominic took Emily to the rooftop of the building where they had first met. The penthouse had been sold long ago, transformed into luxury condos for people who would never know its history. But the view remained the same. The glittering expanse of Manhattan spread out like a promise. He took her hand and led her to the exact spot where they had stood that October night. He reminded her of the rain, the borrowed dress, the fear and desperation that had driven her to walk into his world. He told her that he had known from that first moment that she was different, that she saw something in him that others missed, that she had the power to save him in ways she could not understand. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Emily's heart stopped. Time itself seemed to hold its breath as Dominic lowered himself to one knee, his eyes never leaving hers. He told her that he had spent his whole life accumulating power, money, influence. He had built an empire that stretched across the country. He had commanded armies, negotiated with kings, walked through fire and survived. But nothing he had ever done compared to loving her. Nothing he had ever built compared to what they had created together. And he wanted to spend the rest of his life proving that he was worthy of the gift she had given him. He asked her to marry him. Emily looked down at the man kneeling before her, at the ring glittering in the city light, at the future spreading out before them like an unwritten story. She thought about everything they had been through, the danger and the fear and the moments when it seemed like the world itself was trying to tear them apart. She thought about her mother, who would cry with joy when she heard the news. She thought about the children they might have someday, raised in a world so different from the one Dominic had known. She thought about the journey that had brought them here, from a hospital bed to a penthouse party, to this rooftop where their story had begun. Then she said yes. She said yes with tears streaming down her face and laughter bubbling up from somewhere deep inside. She said yes with her whole heart, holding nothing back, giving herself completely to the future they would build together. Dominic slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her, and as they stood together on that rooftop with the city shining below, Emily knew that this was the ending she had never dared to hope for. But it was also a beginning. Chapter 6. The wedding took place on a summer afternoon, in a garden overlooking the Hudson River. Emily wore white. Dominic wore a smile that his men had never seen before. Their guests were an unlikely mix of two worlds, nurses and executives, old friends from Brooklyn and associates from the organization, all gathered together to witness what everyone agreed was a miracle. Sarah Carter sat in the front row, healthy and radiant, wiping tears from her cheeks as she watched her daughter walk down the aisle. She had survived. Her daughter had survived. And somehow, impossibly, they had both found happiness. The ceremony was simple and sincere. They wrote their own vows, speaking words that meant more because they had lived them. Dominic promised to protect Emily, to honor her strength, to spend every day earning the love she had given him. Emily promised to stand beside him, to believe in his transformation, to build a future that proved love could conquer even the darkest past. When they kissed, the garden erupted in cheers, and Emily thought that if she had known, standing in the rain outside that hospital 2 years ago, that this was where her desperate choice would lead, she would have walked into that penthouse party without a moment's hesitation. The years that followed were rich with the ordinary miracles of a life well lived. They had 2 children, a daughter named after Dominic's mother, and a son who had Emily's smile and his father's stubborn determination. The brownstone in Brooklyn filled with laughter, with homework and music lessons and dinner parties that lasted until midnight. Dominic's transformation was complete. The shadow empire that had defined his family for generations was gone, replaced by a network of legitimate businesses that employed thousands and served millions. He sat on charity boards, funded scholarships, spoke at conferences about corporate responsibility. He was still Dominic Ferraro, still a man whose name carried weight, but the weight was different now. It was the weight of respect, not fear. Emily became the director of nursing for the clinic system, overseeing care for communities that had once been forgotten. She trained the next generation of nurses, sharing not just her medical knowledge but her belief in the power of compassion. She told them that every patient had a story, a family, a reason to survive. She told them that their job was not just to heal bodies, but to honor the courage of people fighting to live. She never told them her own story. That remained between her and Dominic, a secret they shared in the quiet hours between sleeping and waking. But she carried it with her always, a reminder of how far she had come, of what she had been willing to risk for love. Sometimes late at night, Emily would stand at the window of their brownstone and look out at the city lights. She would think about the girl she had been, so desperate and so afraid, standing in the rain with nothing but hope. She would think about the path that had led her here, through darkness and danger and doubt, to this life that exceeded every dream she had ever allowed herself to have, and she would whisper a thank you into the night, to fate, to fortune, to whatever force had guided her steps, to the man sleeping in the next room, who had seen something in her that she had not seen in herself, to the love that had saved them both, because that was the truth of it, in the end. Dominic had not saved her. She had not saved him. They had saved each other, two broken people who had found each other in the darkness and held on until they found the light. That was the miracle. That was the story worth telling, and it was only the beginning. If you have watched this far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I have watched this far," so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. Your support means the world to me. And if this story touched your heart, if you felt something watching Emily and Dominic find their way to each other, then please take a moment to hit the like button. Share this video with someone who needs to believe that love can conquer anything. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time. Join this community of people who believe in the power of stories to change our lives. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching, and remember, no matter how dark the storm, there is always someone out there who will choose to protect rather than destroy. There is always hope. Until next time.